We're going to talk about one of those other amendments, the ones that Republicans forget about sometimes. As we like to remind Republicans who might be tuning into the show, there's a wide constitutional world beyond the Second Amendment. Embrace it, folks. Immerse yourself. The First Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, the Ninth, the 10th, the 14th. These are all issues that we discuss routinely here on the Coalition. But just as folks from the Goldwater Institute joined us a few weeks ago, possibly the most divisive, I want to sound like I'm on public radio, not divisive, divisive issue here in America today is, of course, free speech and how it's been evidenced on campuses in recent months. Here at the Coalition, we like to engage in thought. Wonkish as that may seem, we like to engage in conversations with folks. I'll use a tennis metaphor. People who are smarter than us. You play tennis against people who are better than you, you get smarter. That's what we do here at the Coalition. I have people on who are a lot smarter than I, who are focusing on issues germane to American life, to the culture wars, and to really the future of America as we know it. Zach, welcome to the Coalition for the very first time in what I hope will be a never-ending stream of visits until maybe someday we wake up and someone can walk onto a campus, not have to search out a free speech zone, be willing to talk about something controversial, and not literally be attacked. But welcome on board.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Great. All right, so this is your first visit here. And like we do with a handful, we're very selective here. We've found some of the best thought people, if you will, here in America, and we're having them on the show. So I want to set the foundation for this half hour that you have time to spend with us tonight. You rerouted your train schedule and your commuting schedule and everything for us, so we're incredibly grateful. So tell us about FIRE, what it stands for, how it came to be, and the type of work you're doing there.
I'd be happy to. Thank you for having me on. So FIRE stands for the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, and we defend students' rights and free speech on college campuses. And this includes all First Amendment rights, freedom of religion, assembly, petition. We defend academic freedom for students and for professors, and of course, due process, students' rights. The idea that if you're accused on campus of something, whether it's really bad or minor, maybe trivial, you should have a fair trial. You should be innocent until proven guilty.
Now, let's dive right into that, because my foundation, if you will, in studying scholarly, I'll call it the world of academia and the judicial system that exists within it, of course, is somewhat limited to, I believe, one of the greatest film noirs ever made in America. Largely, of course, it was a product of the 1970s into the 1980s, which I refer to that film movement as the Saturday Night Live era. So who can forget, of course, the Omegas and Animal House holding a judiciary hearing with, John Belushi, in really the most dramatic role in his life, all right, standing out, and where we also learned the immortal pre-med, pre-law, what's the difference? But what is the reality today of jurisprudence on college campuses?
The jurisprudence at college campuses. Well, a lot of campuses we found out we're going to release on Tuesday a due process report. They're not very good for due process. They don't give their students these basic fundamental rights that we agree in our free society people should have when they're accused of really heinous crimes like sexual assault, for example. And look, we see that these crimes or these transgressions on college campuses, they're really bad and they should be dealt with by the college. But the important thing is determining truth. Did this actually happen? And the best way you do that is by giving students due process. It's both for the victims and the accused. We want to know what happened here. And that's why we allow students to have a fair proceeding and to go through campus with these rights.
There's obviously a great deal of controversy in the last few years, particularly, for example, let's talk about Columbia University. You had a young woman there who felt compelled, as the victim of sexual assault, to carry in a work of self-described performance art a mattress for the last year and a half, every tenure as a student at Columbia University, because the school had so blatantly mishandled, in her estimation, the case that she was involved in. Is it appropriate? I mean, why? First of all, I guess as an amateur here, why are colleges immersing themselves in this type of legal environment? Are they prepared for it?
That's a great question. Colleges are forced to adjudicate cases of felony level sexual assault because of Title IX, because they receive funding from the federal government. And because they receive this funding, they must prevent sexual harassment, which has been defined to include sexual assault and generally sexual misconduct. And unfortunately, they're very ill-equipped to deal with this felony level offense. I mean, in outside of college, you have this offense dealt with professionals, prosecutors, police officers, investigators, and you give the defendant a full review of their constitutional rights. However, in colleges, you have these, if I may say so, kangaroo courts,
right,
where you have these professors, administrators who are not trained in conducting a fair trial or investigating these issues, determining whether a student committed a rape, and which, if they are accused of rape and if they are found guilty of this, it could literally ruin their life. They will not be allowed in other educational institutions, and they are branded a sexual offender for the rest of their lives.
Because given the fumbling, misguided attempts, and by the way, I want to make it clear that both alleged victim and alleged perpetrator are often equally, I'll say, the victims of the process. No one gets out really unscathed, it would seem, in any one of these difficult campus situations. No one gets out alive. There's very often a great deal of harm done to the alleged and often proven victim, and at the same time, there's an element of, when did you stop beating your wife, sir, to the person who is the accused perpetrator. In an area, in an age group where consent is often nebulous or confused, I mean, let's talk about some of the issues in a typical legal environment. Chain of evidence, admissibility in court of testimony. Are any of these folks at any level prepared to deal with this? If you're someone with a graduate degree in education, how does that remotely qualify you to prosecute the law?
You're exactly right. I mean, we've seen from victims, from the accused, from almost all parties involved in the sexual assault process, that schools, they criticize schools for not doing a good job, for being unfair to the alleged victims, the alleged perpetrators, to everybody. And most of the reason is why they're just not equipped to deal with it. They don't have the training. And the best thing that we can do is to give the students due process rights, presumption of innocence, the right to present evidence, the right to defend themselves, the right to challenge the bias of the fact finder. All these basic fundamental rights will help the schools and help the alleged victims and the perpetrators actually find the truth and make this process good for all parties involved.
So, fire operates on a number of different levels. And let's take something, and obviously this is a sensitive area. We're not attempting to try campus race trials here, by the way. What we're attempting to put on trial for the purpose of this show is the processes by which they take place. So, stepping aside from the depravity of the alleged crime, a student is arrested by campus police, ostensibly, or charged. How does fire get involved, or on a case-by-case level, and at the same time, what are fire recommending on the macro level?
On the individual level, we have our individual rights defense program, where we have students that either have their due process rights, their free speech rights violated, contact us, and we work with them. Sometimes we refer them to an attorney, and we try to achieve justice by them. A lot of times it involves us writing letters to the school on the student's behalf, and to pretty much encourage the school to follow their promises. They promise their students free speech and due process. They have to abide by those policies. And if it's a public school and they violate their students' free speech rights, they have to abide by constitutional law, by the First Amendment. That's what we do on a micro level. On a macro level, we have our policy reform department, where we encourage schools to reform their policies, to get rid of their speech codes, these policies on campus that inflict student free speech. And we also have our lobbying department, where we encourage state legislatures to, for example, abolish these free speech zones on their state colleges, where speech is quarantined, is cabined in these very small, sometimes cordoned off and swampy areas of campus. So we operate at a very large level in terms of arguing for universities and for state reps to abolish their policies that infringe students' rights and free speech, but also we work with individual students whose rights are violated by their university.
This is so timely, Because now, whereas say 2 or 3 years ago, the hot button, if you will, was campus rape, now we're talking about out and out the ability to conduct a protest, a demonstration, a lecture, a discussion on universities which ascribe to themselves the mantle of intellectualism, while at the same time so many of these universities squelch it at every opportunity. I'll retell the story that I told a few weeks ago when my older daughter visited Georgetown University. The campus tour guide, your typical sophomore or junior in college, is sort of happy to have a work-study job, actually threw this out, and it was kind of interesting because it was very telling because he wasn't really thinking about it, but he pointed out at Georgetown University, arguably the nation's premier international relations school, the free speech zone. To which, much to the horror of my daughter, I pointed out, funny, I thought the entire country was a free speech zone. I didn't think you were limited to this one, 8 by 10, out of the way. How did we get here? How did we? I mean, by your estimate, how many schools? And this is a broad number. I'm painting with a broad brush here, but how many schools openly try to place into an intellectual ghetto free speech? And how did we get here?
Well, based on our recent statistics, we had this Spotlight and Speech Codes database. Around 1 in 10 schools employ a free speech zone. They have this, like you said, in Georgetown University, this very narrow, small area of campus, usually less than 1% of the open outdoor areas of campus that students are allowed to have their full First Amendment rights. And like you said, the entirety of the college, entirety of the public areas in the college at least, should be a free speech zone. And besides that, we have these speech codes where a majority of schools have at least one policy that can be interpreted to suppress free speech. Many schools have multiple policies that substantially suppress free speech. And these are colleges that all promise their students free speech. They promise their students their full area of First Amendment rights, and yet they betray this promise by having these free speech zones and these speech codes, which very clearly suppress student free speech.
How did we get to this point in academia? I'm a graduate of the early 1980s. Pretty much the next generation post Vietnam. There's, as a libertarian, and full disclosure, if folks ever listen to this for the first time, I am the chairman of the Rhode Island Libertarian Party. The irony appears to be that the very generation that broke down the barriers of free speech in the form of civil disobedience in terms of the desire to and discrimination against African Americans, and at the same time crushed it when it came to protesting the Vietnam War, it would appear that very generation is the one building the walls now. What happened?
Like you said, these speech codes and these free speech zones, they've been around for a while. I believe they started decades ago, I believe in the 80s, in response to, in the 60s, I believe, in response to the Vietnam War protesters. These students were protesting on campus. They were creating a ruckus, disrupting people, and they tried to cabin them off into a very narrow zone on campus. And with the speech code, it's a really interesting question. Our president and CEO, Greg Lukianoff, addressed this issue in his book on Learning Liberty. And he's saying that it's more than just the speech code. It's the attitude towards free speech. It's the idea that students should be free from offensive speech, that when they go to college, they should not have their views challenged, that they should be insulated from these hateful, demeaning ideas. And that conception has created this very anti-intellectual environment where students are refusing to discuss controversial topics. They're refusing to talk to people they disagree with. And as a result, it's becoming a much more polarized and partisan outlook on campus. And that's the thing we're trying to fight against, that fire.
But isn't the ultimate irony that in order to effectively challenge some of the disgusting thought that's arising in America today, whether it be neo-Nazism, fascism, repression, one actually has to have a thorough understanding of their arguments and their construct, which ultimately can only be gained by a thorough analysis and an outward confrontation of it. How do you challenge the very thoughts that you claim to hate if you have no experience with it?
Exactly. I mean, John Stuart Mill would say that if you only know one side of the argument, you don't know any side at all. You need to be able to see both sides of every issue to come to a nuanced and intelligent conclusion on that issue.
Mm-hmm.
And if you refuse to even read, if you're a conservative, you refuse to read the New York Times, and you're a liberal, you refuse to read the Wall Street Journal, you're missing out on a lot of what the best arguments are against your side. And the best way to advance your point of view, the best way to really try to protest and make the most persuasive arguments is to understand the other side of it and address these arguments. And that requires you to engage in speech that you may believe is offensive. It may offend your deepest sensibilities, but it's important to have that kind of mindset if you're going to be an intellectual.
Right. As a younger person, the author that most impacted my life in the late 70s, early 80s was a gentleman by the name of Nat Hentoff, who was a columnist for the Village Voice, wrote a book, Free Speech for Me, but Not for Thee, which I think the title, you almost didn't have to read the book, because the title just nailed it in a way that I don't think anyone, or few have sense. The notion that there's an sense of entitlement for your opinion, and this is true on both sides, if you will, on the far right and the far left, that your entire life seems to be your version of dismissing the sins of your side because they're not quite as egregious as the sins of the other, when in fact moral equivalencies need to be cast aside, because I thought each side was trying to be, better.
Yeah. If you don't talk to the other side, if you don't see them for valid intellectual adversaries, you kind of learn to demonize them. You learn to see them as subhuman, that they're just racist and bigots, and that we shouldn't even listen to what they're trying to say. Meanwhile, they have some good points in there. To give you an example, last week I saw the play Wicked in Philadelphia,
mm-hmm.
and the large thing about the play was that the Wicked Witch of the West maybe is not that wicked after all. If you just talk to her, if you just see where her motives are and see where she's coming from, figure out where she's going, maybe our adversaries actually aren't as evil as we think they are.
Right. Now, what's your thought? The current rage is the campus shoutdown, and both sides, if you will, have shown a marked proclivity over this for particularly in the last 2 or 3 years. Our special friend Milo seemed to have helped elevate that to an art form. But how pervasive are these shoutdowns right now, and how is FIRE attempting to deal with that?
So we would like to call that a heckler's veto. This idea that...
that's a great term. I'm going to steal that.
Yeah, please do. The heckler's veto is when somebody's giving a speech and the speaker gets shouted down, or violence is used to shut down the speaker. That's generally what a heckler's veto is. The heckler is vetoing the speech using their violence. And that is becoming more prevalent because when these speakers are coming to campuses, they're being protested. You have people blocking the doors to the event. Your speaker is not allowing the speakers to talk at all. As protesters, not allowing the speakers to talk at all. Mm-hmm. And that's really problematic because if somebody's coming to campus and you disagree with them, the best way to advance your side is to attack them during the Q&A. It's to attack their views, not physically, of course. And it is to actually engage with the speaker and try to come to a rational discussion on what your differences are.
Right.
And when you even prevent the speaker from talking to begin with, you deprive the entire student body of the ability to hear what that speaker has to say and to intellectually engage with them after the speech.
Now, let's take the logical extreme, and I'll use an example that was very controversial here at Brown University just a handful of years ago. The then chief of the New York City Police Department visited Brown University and was vetoed. The argument being that the suppression of free speech was a lesser evil to the suppression of one of the architects of stop and frisk, and we loathe stop and frisk here, by the way, for the record. All right, so that allowing him to speak would be somehow allowing him to advance stop and frisk. There's clearly, particularly at Ivy League campuses, have hosted at times folks of far worse behavior. I mean, Ivy League campuses are infamous, if you will, for bringing on board some of the most noted dictators in their lives who seek the imprimatur, if you will, of a Yale or a Columbia or a Harvard by appearing there, not realizing that they're being set up to be exposed for the fools that they are.
Yeah.
Is there ever a point where the sanctity of free speech is outweighed by the dignity afforded to a speaker by allowing them a forum to bring forward their hate?
I don't believe it is. And I want to give you a counterexample to what you mentioned about Ray Kelly, the New York City Police Commissioner. Many years ago, I believe it was at Brown, an actual Nazi, a neo-Nazi, came and he spoke on campus. And the students in the audience respectfully listened to what he had to say. And then during the question and answer period, proceeded to so thoroughly destroy and so thoroughly embarrass this man because of how absolutely wrong and hateful he is. The speaker actually left the room because he was so humiliated based on the intellectual arguments of the students. And it was a beautiful moment for the university because it shows that the marketplace of ideas is working. You have this man who's spouting these hateful words at the audience, hateful arguments, and just by using the freedom of speech, by engaging with him, you can expose him for who he is and defeat him in the marketplace of ideas. So I don't believe that censoring somebody actually discredits them. I think when you censor somebody, you deprive the entire university body and really the world of what they have to say. And even if what they have to say is incredibly hateful, you don't prove that they're wrong by disallowing them to speak. You prove that they're wrong through argumentation. In a free society, we use our words and not our violence to prove that somebody is wrong. Might doesn't necessarily make right.
Now, I agree with you. It's challenging because as you listen to these individuals, you squirm in your seats. You loathe everything. I mean, I love the English language. I love language, and words mean a lot to me. And you sit there, and it's excruciating sometimes. You're embarrassed for them. You're embarrassed for the people you're around. You're embarrassed, well, for the world that these people exist. But ultimately, if we don't expose them for the frauds they are, regardless of whether they're foreign or domestic, the free marketplace, the free exchange of ideas, of individuals, of commerce needs to be maintained. It just absolutely does. We've only got a couple minutes left, but now you folks are coming out with a study on Monday. Just tell us a little bit about that and where they can find it, and again, how they can find out more about FIRE, how they can engage, how they can support.
Sure. Early next week, I believe on Tuesday, we're releasing a due process report. We're analyzing the due process policies that many schools have, so look for that on our website. And if you want to learn more about what the FIRE does, you can visit our website at thefire.org. And if you want to contribute and help us in our fight against censorship and thought reform on campus, feel free to donate at thefire.org/donate.
Great. Listen, you've been listening to Zach Greenberg. He's the Justice Robert H. Jackson Legal Fellow, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. What I'd love to do is have you guys on again in another week or two after the study's been issued, discuss the study in depth, and really just spread the word here, as I love to say, in the free speech haven of New England. Ironically, the home of Roger Williams, the home of freedom of religion, it's become so compromised here that we need your voice, and folks need to support you folks in turn. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
And